This week in EDUC 140, we will focus on the regulation of the social environment. We will also briefly start off by looking at how we can create a physical environment that is conducive to encoding new memories. Let's revisit this graph that explains the levels of concentration that we go through when studying in a distracting environment versus an environment conducive to studying. First, we'll examine what an ideal study session looks like. When we are able to reduce distractions, such as preventing our phones pinging or lighting up, turning off music with lyrics or the TV in the background, going someplace where we will not have to listen to others talking, or reducing the amount of clutter in our line of sight, we are able to get into deep concentration, or the zone, in about 10 minutes. This level of concentration allows true change to occur in the long-term memory. Without this change, true learning does not occur. Unfortunately, we tend to have many distractions in our environment, and our study sessions look like the bottom half of the graph. We live in a time where such a small device like a smartphone can have limitless distractions. And with every distraction, we are ultimately dragged all the way back to light concentration, making the change in long-term memory that is necessary for learning very difficult. The reduction of distractions is the main reason we need to engage in regulating our social and physical environment. It enhances learning by allowing for deep concentration to occur, which facilitates change in the long-term memory. When we are able to limit the sensory information that comes into our short-term sensory store, it helps to create an environment that will not be competing for the attention of our working memory. While this concept may be very simple, it takes a learner who is self-motivated to create such an environment and to take the difficult steps of limiting the distractions that can be so tempting. This will become more obvious as we learn the negative outcomes that result from trying to multitask. Let's take a look at those next. So let's be honest. Where are you studying? Is it somewhere quiet or perhaps your dorm room or apartment? What distractions are present while you're studying? Are you checking your email, texting your friends, posting pictures on Instagram, singing your favorite song? Essentially, are you multitasking? Common wisdom says some people are great multitaskers, but research does not support this myth. First, we do not multitask. What we are doing is actually task switching. While we can do simple things like walking and chewing gum at the same time, we cannot engage in more than one complex task at a time. For example, we cannot sing a song and take notes at the same time. Both of these tasks involve language, which makes them complex tasks. So if we were trying to engage in both simultaneously, our working memories would switch from singing the song to listening to the lecture, which would make it highly unlikely that we'd do either task even moderately well. This would ultimately fatigue our executive control system and cause cognitive overload. Research has also found the following 4 negative outcomes when trying to multitask. First, the assignment takes longer to complete because of the time spent on distracting activities and because upon returning to the assignment, the student has to refamiliarize herself with the material. Second, the mental fatigue caused by repeatedly dropping and picking up a mental thread leads to more mistakes. The cognitive cost of such task switching is especially high when students alternate between tasks that call for different sets of expressive rules, such as the formal, precise language required for an English essay and the casual, friendly tone of an email to a friend. Third, students' subsequent memories of what they're working on will be impaired if their attention is divided. Although we often assume that our memories fail at the moment we can't recall a fact or concept, the failure may actually have occurred earlier, at the time we originally saved or encoded the memory. The moment of encoding is what matters most for retention, and dozens of laboratory studies have demonstrated that when our attention is divided during encoding, we remember that piece of information less well or not at all. Fourth, some research has suggested that when we're distracted, our brains actually process and store information in different, less useful ways. In a 2006 study, participants were asked to engage in a learning activity on a computer while carrying out a second task, counting musical tones that sounded while they worked. Study subjects who did both tasks at once appeared to learn just as well as subjects who did the first task by itself. But upon further probing, the former group proved much less adept at extending and extrapolating their new knowledge to novel contexts, a key capacity that psychologists call transfer. Brain scans taken during the experiment revealed that different regions of the brain were active under the two conditions, indicating that the brain engages in a different form of memory when forced to pay attention to two streams of information at once. Finally, researchers are beginning to demonstrate that media multitasking while learning is negatively associated with student grades. Research has recently found that students who used Facebook during a 15-minute observation period had lower grade point averages than those who didn't go on the site. And two recent studies found that texting and using Facebook in class and while doing homework were negatively correlated with college students' GPAs. In conclusion, regulating our physical environment by limiting distractions can not only support us in getting into the zone while studying, but prevent us from engaging in multitasking that is detrimental to encoding and retrieval of new information. For the rest of this lecture, we will focus on regulating our social environment. This skill is important in college as many students are in a new environment where they are encountering new social situations both inside and outside of class. We will eventually discuss working in groups, but first let's start by taking a look at the different types of help seeking. Since no one is able to access a person's long-term memories, it would seem that learning is a very isolated task. But decades of research has demonstrated that learning is actually very social in nature, and so it is important to examine how we engage in the social aspects of learning. First, because college is much more student-centered than high school, it is important that students are able and willing to seek help when they need it. Let's look at a quadrant that explains the different types of help seeking. The first dimension is action. Students either seek or do not seek help. The second dimension is whether or not help is actually necessary. It either is necessary or it is not necessary. Help seeking is very important, but is it always a good thing? Let's see. Adaptive help seeking occurs when a learner both needs and seeks help. This usually means that the learner has attempted to solve their own problem and has gotten stuck. This may be more difficult than it sounds because in our individualistic society, seeking help is sometimes viewed as something that is not culturally appropriate. With this in mind, it may be beneficial for you to think about help seeking as seeking input, consultation, or even advice. Seeking help when you need it makes you more adaptable and ultimately a better problem solver. Some learners avoid seeking help even though they need it. Why would someone not ask for help when it is necessary? The learner could be disengaged from the course or task, or could be struggling to find the answers by oneself. What types of belief about ability would avoidant students likely have? The belief that ability is fixed and attributing poor performance to a lack of ability rather than a lack of effort. Students with a fixed mindset are much less likely to seek help even when they need it, as they will view it as a sign that they are not smart enough to complete the task. Remember, those with a fixed mindset are focused on proving their ability as opposed to improving their intelligence. While help seeking when it is necessary is very adaptive, some students engage in dependent help seeking, which can actually make others less likely to help. There are times when learners should do something before they seek help. For example, if there is a paper due, the learner should review any notes from the class or the syllabus to gain a basic understanding of what the assignment is about. This will also help the learner figure out what exactly they are confused about so they can ask specific questions to their professor, TA, or classmate. Dependent help seeking is when learners ask for help and expect others to explain every detail to them. When this occurs, it is very obvious to the person or persons who are doing the helping that the learner is a dependent help seeker, and they may be less likely to help that learner in the future. Dependent help seeking is sort of the codependency of help seeking help when it is not necessary, or seeking help without trying to work on things by oneself first. Adaptive other actions are steps a learner can take to help him or herself prior to seeking help from others. For example, reading the syllabus to better understand expectations, reviewing task instructions to see what an assignment entails, using Google to find a credible source on the internet that may explain a complicated concept in a more understandable way. While seeking help when we need it is very important in being self-regulated, it is also imperative that we take adaptive actions to try to help ourselves first. Next, we're going to look at the ways in which we communicate, how communication can break down, and how we can improve how we receive and send messages. As self-regulated learners, we need to understand how to effectively communicate with those around us. Before we get into how we can improve our ability to communicate, here are 4 false principles of communication. If you say it, the other person will understand. If you've ever gotten into a heated discussion with someone because of a misunderstanding, you know this first principle is definitely not true. The more communication, the better. Sometimes more is said by less. Any problem can be solved if people communicate with each other. It's important to note that how people communicate is very important. Sometimes direct communication between people can make matters worse. Some people are born communicators, some are not. This is simply not true. There are strategies that can be learned that are sure to increase your effectiveness as a communicator. So how do we communicate? We receive messages and we send messages. When receiving messages, we read and listen, and when sending messages, we speak and write. Looking at these 4 subtypes of communication, which do we take courses in? From the time you were very young, you've had direct instruction on how to read, write, and speak, but it is very rare that we are taught how to listen. This is ironic because of the fact that we are listening for approximately 70% of the time that we are communicating with others. Now, it is important to distinguish between hearing and listening. The difference between the two can cause serious problems in receiving messages. We've talked about this difference when discussing learning from lectures. So what is the difference? Hearing is a passive activity of having a message in our ears. It is non-selective and involuntary. Listening, on the other hand, is an active process. It is voluntary and incorporates interpreting and responding. In other words, when we are listening, we are making meaning out of the messages we are hearing. Where hearing only engages our short-term sensory store, listening involves our working memory. In the next slides, we will discuss listening and the ways in which problems can arise. This is especially important to consider because the vast majority of your time working in groups is spent listening. Listening, which can make up 70% of the time that we are communicating, is an important skill to focus on in college. In order to improve this skill, we have to become aware of the forms of non-listening we engage in. Any one of these forms of non-listening can occur at the time that we are receiving messages, and we often appear to be listening even though the opposite is true. So why is listening a problem to begin with? While we can listen and process up to 500 words per minute, people can only speak about 150 words per minute. This leaves our minds with a lot of figurative space to think about or attend to other things while trying to pay attention to the person or people talking. This makes listening, which we may think of as an easy task, a task that requires a lot of self-discipline. While the 5 forms of non-listening are being introduced, reflect on which one or two you may engage in most. Pseudo-listening. This is when we appear to be listening, but our minds are elsewhere. We want to appear conscientious, although we really aren't interested in the conversation. We don't want to hurt the person's feelings, but we are either preoccupied with or more interested in other things. This is also a sign that the message being sent bores us, possibly hearing about your friend's same problem for the 100th time, making small talk, or sitting in a lecture that does not interest you. When we are pseudo-listening, we give ourselves away when our responses reveal that we're not paying attention. Monopolizing is using our response to shift the conversation toward ourselves. We interrupt to divert attention to ourselves or to the topics of our interest. For example, if your friend was talking about her roommate problems and then you shifted the conversation to an argument you had with your roommate the night before. Next, we have selective listening. This is when we screen out parts of the message that don't interest us or with which we disagree, and only pay attention to those parts that interest us. For example, when the TA says, "This will be on the test," everyone listens up. Selective listening also occurs when we reject communication that bores us or makes us uncomfortable, such as a smoker who ignores a commercial that talks about smoking causing lung cancer. Defensive listening is when we listen defensively. We assume others don't like, trust, or respect us. We are mind reading and assuming the other person's intent, no matter how innocent their communication is. Some people are generally defensive, while others can be defensive specific to topics, vulnerable times, or even certain people. Lastly, ambushing is listening carefully for the purpose of attacking the speaker. It involves very careful listening, but the motivation is not to understand the sender's message. It is to twist their message and use it against them. People who engage in this type of listening arouse defensiveness in others. Can you think of someone who may use this skill in their favor? If you're thinking of a lawyer in a courtroom, you're absolutely correct. Take a moment and reflect on which of these forms of non-listening you engage in the most. While we often deny these to others, it is important to become aware of when we are engaging in them so we can become more effective listeners. Going back to the 4 subtypes of communication, we will now focus on sending messages, particularly speaking. It is important that we deliver messages in a way that people will understand us and not get defensive. So in the next several slides, we are going to talk about how to send messages effectively. More specifically, we are going to look at ineffective you messages and how we can change them into I messages. Social media gives us some great examples of ineffective communication. Here is a you message posted on Twitter to John Krasinski from The Office. Here's another posted by Alicia Keys that is directed at Kim and Kanye West. While these past 2 examples may have been posted more for entertainment purposes, here is a real-life example from an undergraduate student to a professor. Take a second to read it. What is the intended message of the student? What was he or she asking? How do you think the professor interpreted this message? How would you interpret this message? What would your response be? Ultimately, the student wanted clarity on their grade in the class, but because of the way the message was delivered, they may not have gotten the answer they were seeking. So how could the student have changed their message to be more effective? This is where iMessages come in. Take a moment to read these 2 messages. Imagine someone was saying these to you. How would you interpret them differently? What would your reactions and responses be to the 2 separate messages? The first one is likely to put you immediately on the defensive. It's a you message. The second message, the I message, focuses on the sender, not the receiver. It does not assign blame, but expresses how the sender feels. The best way to get a point across in a clear, direct, and honest way without evoking defensiveness from others is through using I messages. The essence of the you message is you have a problem, while the essence of an I message is I have a problem. You messages lay blame and convey criticism through a verbal attack, while I messages are assertive statements that focus on the sender's needs and feelings rather than the traits and behaviors of the receiver. This raises the odds that the receiver will hear the sender's needs clearly. iMessages do not assign blame and are a way for the sender to constructively tell the receiver what their specific need is so they can hear it and assist in helping. When we use iMessages, we are engaging in straight thinking. With you messages, we are the victims and only the effect of someone else's actions. But with iMessages, we are essentially articulating the belief that it is not the activating event that causes our behavior, but it is our beliefs that cause our emotional and behavioral reactions. This puts us back in control. So how do we create an iMessage? Here's the strategy. Step 1. State the feelings the behavior produces for you. Step 2. Describe the behavior which is triggering your feelings. And step 3. State the consequence of this behavior. For example, if your roommate continuously leaves their books and papers scattered on your shared table, you might use the following iMessage. I feel frustrated when you leave your books and papers on the table because I cannot find enough room to do my homework. Notice the sentence starts out by stating a feeling, I feel frustrated, and then lets the receiver know what is frustrating the sender, that they're leaving their books and papers on the table. The last portion of the sentence tells the receiver why this is a problem, because the sender can't find enough room to do their homework. Let's look at other tips to use when we're sending iMessages. Like developing any other skill, using iMessages effectively takes practice. Here are some tips to help you along the way. First, use the script when practicing iMessages, but make sure to communicate a feeling and not a judgment. For example, I feel that you are a jerk is a disguised you message. 2. Practice delivering iMessages. Focus on having a growth mindset, meaning you must believe that you will improve with effort. Using iMessages may feel awkward and inauthentic at first, but with practice, you will become much more effective at using iMessages to clearly communicate your needs. Third, use the person's name to begin the message. There is plenty of research that states people listen more carefully when they hear their name. Fourth, deliver iMessages one-to-one, never in public. And lastly, never deliver an iMessage when you're angry. Your anger will easily translate through your facial expressions and body language and will likely put the receiver on the defensive. You want to make sure your nonverbal body language is consistent with your statement. Remember from past lectures that nonverbal cues make up more than 55% of communication. Learning how to send iMessages can greatly improve communication with others. Let's give it a try on the next slide. Here is the you message. You need to get off your phone when we're trying to have a conversation because it's just rude. How would you change this to an iMessage? Pause the video and practice changing this you message to an iMessage. Remember to start with a feeling. How did you do? Here is an example of an iMessage that could be used in this situation. I'm really frustrated when you're on your phone while we're talking because it makes me feel like you aren't listening to me. Notice the focus is on I have a problem and is not blaming the other person for the feelings that occurred. Remember, practice and effort will improve your iMessage skills. Next, we'll look at the issues that can arise when we are working in groups. In the 1970s, group work became big business. The belief was that many heads are better than one. But does working in groups really work? If so, under which conditions does it work? And how many heads are better than one? A whole new area of research was born that studied these questions, and two major issues with group work were discovered: social loafing and groupthink. We will discuss these two issues on the next few slides. With social loafing, many hands make diminished responsibility. This is almost counterintuitive because one would think that the more people there are to help, the more productive a group would be. But at a certain point, groups stop generating ideas and solutions commensurate with their size. Research says the optimum number is less than 6 people. So, what exactly is social loafing? Social loafing is the tendency for people to exert less effort when they pool their effort toward a common goal than when they are individually responsible. One 1974 experiment manipulated whether people thought they were in a tug of war contest by themselves or with 2 to 5 other people on their team. People were first blindfolded and then urged to pull on a rope as hard as they can. When people thought they were pulling alone, they pulled 18% harder than when they thought they were pulling as part of a group. Similar results were found when people thought they were either shouting, clapping, or riding exercise bikes in a group. Researchers repeatedly found that the average individual performance decreased with group size. How does social loafing appear in everyday life? A good example of this is that most farms in the 1970s were collectively operated. A 1979 study showed that only 1% of the land, which was privately farmed, produced 27% of the yearly crop output. So, what does this mean for a college student in the 21st century? It means that when you are working in groups or forming a study group, be sure to keep the group to a minimum size. Definitely less than 6, but maybe more like 3 or 4. Be sure everyone knows what they are responsible for and hold people accountable for the work they produce. Lastly, reward or reinforce group members for their work. This can be as simple as thanking people for their effort or even having treats for people who show up to meetings and work. Working in groups can be very beneficial as long as you are aware of the ways in which to prevent social loafing as well as groupthink. Let's take a look at groupthink next. True or false? The greater the loyalty in a group, the better its decisions will be. This statement is false. Similarity of members is not necessarily effective and has produced several real-life disasters. When a homogeneous, highly cohesive group is so concerned with maintaining unanimity that they fail to evaluate all their alternatives and options, we call this groupthink. As humans, we are very social beings, and we do not respond well to the possible rejection we will receive if we go against the grain. We tend to conform to the rules of the group, whether they are directly told to us or just implied. For example, think about how you behave in an elevator. Which way do you face? Do you speak loudly in an elevator, or do you tend to stay quiet even if you are with someone you know? What if there is a stranger in the elevator with you? Where would you stand? Near the other person, or would you give them as much space as possible? These are all social norms that we follow even though no one has directly taught them to us. The same kinds of norms can develop in group settings and can cause people to stay in harmony with the group even if they have concerns. Sometimes even if these concerns can lead to a life or death situation. Have you seen the specific type of Mercedes on the roads, the A-Class? Probably not, and this is because this model is a product of groupthink. Although some of the engineers that designed this car found flaws in its design, the car actually made it to the production line and was built. But when it was test driven, it was found to roll over at 40 miles an hour. It was a complete failure and was not safe to put on the roads. When the failure was analyzed, it was a perfect example of groupthink, where the naysayers silenced themselves to display loyalty to the group. While this is a recent example of groupthink that cost Mercedes-Benz large amounts of time and money, there have been more other serious examples that have cost lives. The 1986 Challenger explosion that killed 7 astronauts, including one school teacher, is another example of groupthink. It was found that the engineering group that designed the part of the shuttle that was responsible for the explosion had warned NASA that the part would fail in cold weather. Because NASA had already postponed the launch once, there was a private meeting between NASA and the engineering group where NASA basically pressured the engineering group into signing off on the shuttle launch the next day. Ultimately, NASA was able to pressure the members of the engineering group into keeping in harmony with their goal of setting the launch, and it resulted in the death of 7 innocent people. So now that we know groupthink can be a problem, how do we prevent it? Group leaders can prevent groupthink by encouraging members to raise objections and concerns. Give ample wait time for people to voice what their concerns are, and be careful that your body language is matching your request. Letting members state their ideas first. Sometimes people will stop thinking if they feel that someone else, especially a leader, brings an idea to the table. Allow the group to brainstorm to generate various ideas. Seeking input from outside of the group. Group norms and rules can develop very quickly, so it is a good idea to have someone from outside of the group, like another classmate, a TA, or professor, review the group's ideas before going to the final stages of a project or assignment. Assigning a member to play the devil's advocate. Having someone focus their working memory on challenging the group and looking at things from another perspective is a good way to keep the group in check. Lastly, setting an expectation for critical review prior to a final project. Have everyone take a day or 2 or 3 to think on their own and bring back concerns and objections prior to finalizing a project. Again, working in groups has many benefits, especially since we as humans learn socially. But we need to be aware of the pitfalls of working in groups so we can work smarter. Finally, as you are learning this week, reflect on these questions. How can you change your study environment to make it more conducive to reaching deep concentration? How can you engage in more adaptive help seeking? What forms of non-listening do you mainly engage in? How can you improve your listening skills? How can you incorporate iMessages into conflicts that arise between you and others? How can you avoid social loafing and groupthink when working in groups? Don't forget to take the quiz via Blackboard.